The wind that afternoon was dry and restless, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and old wood from the fields that surrounded the small town of Hollow Creek. The sky was a dull shade of gold, the kind that warned of a storm waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. The town's main road stretched straight through its heart, a thin ribbon of cracked dirt lined with leaning posts, a creaky saloon, and a few shops that had seen better days. People moved slowly here, as if the air itself held them down. Life wasn't fast, but it was heavy, and everyone carried something they didn't talk about. On that day, a wagon rolled into town from the east, its wheels turning like slow grinding thoughts. A young woman sat inside, wrapped in a faded shawl, her hands folded across her rounded belly. She was clearly far along in pregnancy, the kind of state where even the smallest movement came with care. Her eyes were tired but sharp, scanning the road ahead, as if she was looking for something she couldn't name. She wasn't from Hollow Creek, that much was clear. Her clothes were simple, but cleaner than what most women in town could manage. The way she carried herself had a quiet confidence that didn't belong to this dusty place. The wagon stopped near the trading post, and the driver, an older man with a worn hat and a slow drawl, helped her down. She thanked him softly and pressed a few coins into his hand before he turned the wagon around and rode off toward the hills. She stood there for a moment, taking in the stillness of the town. Hollow Creek wasn't the kind of place people came to unless they were running from something or looking to hide. Maybe she was doing both. Inside the trading post, the air smelled of tobacco, dry leather, and sawdust.
Oh.
A few men stood near the counter, talking in low tones about the cattle auction that had gone wrong the week before. They stopped when she walked in, their voices dropping completely. The shopkeeper, a tall man with thinning hair, nodded politely but didn't smile. Around here, strangers were noticed but rarely welcomed. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unkind. She nodded. "I heard someone here has got a boy for sale." The men near the counter exchanged glances. One of them let out a short laugh, but it wasn't friendly. The shopkeeper looked uneasy. "You mean the sheriff's holding that drifter's kid?" "Yeah, they got him down at the barn behind the station." "What's your business with him?" Her hand went again to her belly. "I want to buy him." The words hung there like smoke in still air. For a moment, no one spoke. The men looked at her as if she'd just confessed something wicked. The shopkeeper frowned. "Buy him?
Our lady.
That's not something folks do around here."
He's a runaway, not property.
She didn't flinch. "You said they're keeping him locked up. That sounds close enough." Outside, a wagon clattered past, breaking the silence. The woman's eyes didn't leave the shopkeeper's face. Something in her tone made him realize she wasn't joking. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a small cloth pouch, setting it on the counter. The soft jingle of coins filled the room. "Take it to the sheriff," she said. "Tell him I'll take the boy off his hands. He doesn't belong in a cell." The men stared at her, some with suspicion, others with curiosity. There was something unusual about the way she spoke. Not desperate, not proud, just steady, like she'd already made peace with whatever this choice meant. When she walked back outside, the wind had shifted. Clouds gathered to the west, the promise of rain moving closer. She stood there, her shawl fluttering against her shoulders, watching as a group of children ran across the street, laughing. For a moment she smiled faintly. Then she turned toward the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man built broad from years of wrangling trouble, sat behind his desk with his boots propped up and a hat pulled low over his brow. He looked up when she stepped in. "Afternoon, ma'am. You lost?" "No," she said quietly. "I came for the boy." He raised an eyebrow. "Mean the one we found down by the river? He's no kin of yours?" "I'll take him anyway," she said. "I'll pay for his release." The sheriff studied her face, trying to read the reason behind her calm. "Ma'am, this ain't the kind of thing money fixes. The boy's wild, doesn't talk much. He's probably been on the run half his life. You don't know what you're asking for." She reached into her pouch again, pulling out a few folded bills. "I know enough," she said, "and I know what it feels like to be left with nowhere to go." That last line made the sheriff pause. There was something in her voice, not pleading, but heavy with memory. He slowly lowered his boots to the floor, rubbed his jaw, and sighed. "Do you really mean to take him?" She nodded. He hesitated, then stood and motioned for her to follow him out back. The barn stood behind the jailhouse, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, it smelled of hay and damp air. Single lantern burned near the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. The boy sat on a wooden crate, his hands bound loosely, his clothes torn and dirty. He looked up when they entered, his eyes dark and sharp beneath tangled hair. "This him," the sheriff said. "We found him sneaking around the river camp. Said he was looking for food, but wouldn't tell us where he came from." The woman stepped closer. The boy's gaze flicked to her belly, then back to her face. He didn't say anything. She crouched a little, her knees creaking softly under the weight she carried. "What's your name?" she asked. He didn't answer. She waited a long moment before speaking again. "I'm not here to hurt you. I want to take you with me, somewhere safe." The sheriff leaned against the wall, watching. "He's been silent since we found him. You'll have your hands full, lady." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing life doesn't often hand out easy choices. "I already do," she said, and then more softly she added, "But maybe that's why I'm here." The boy's eyes lingered on her for a moment, then lowered again. She reached out, untying the ropes around his wrists. The sheriff started to protest, but she cut him off with a look that carried quiet determination. "You've got enough lost souls to handle, Sheriff. Let me take this one." He hesitated, then nodded. "Your choice," he said, his tone low. "Is don't come back saying, I didn't warn you." When they stepped out into the open air, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow and cold. She led the boy toward the road, holding the small bundle of her belongings under one arm. The town watched from behind half-closed doors as the strange pair walked toward the edge of Hollow Creek, the pregnant woman and the silent boy. Some shook their heads, others whispered. By the time they reached the old wooden bridge that crossed the creek, the rain had turned steady. The woman paused there, resting a hand on the railing. "We'll find a place to stay for the night," she said softly. "Then we'll talk." The boy looked at her, his face unreadable. For the first time, he spoke, his voice barely louder than the rain. "Why'd you buy me?" She looked out over the water, the current swirling beneath them. Her voice was quiet, almost to herself. "Because someone once bought my freedom, and I never got to thank them." The boy's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with curiosity. But before he could ask more, thunder rolled in the distance. The woman turned toward the road again, her hand instinctively pressing against her stomach. Something inside her told her this was just the beginning, and whatever she had set in motion would change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. As they disappeared into the fading storm, Hollow Creek returned to its stillness. But the people who had seen her that day would remember the look in her eyes, a mix of sorrow and strength, and the strange way the wind had carried her words. No one could have known that her offer to buy a boy would stir up old secrets buried deep beneath the town's quiet surface, or that what began as an act of compassion would uncover a truth powerful enough to break them. All the road out of Hollow Creek was rough and narrow, cutting through miles of open land that stretched farther than the eye could see. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, softening the dust and turning the road to mud. The woman walked carefully, one hand holding her shawl close, the other clutching the small satchel that held all she owned. The boy followed a few steps behind, his bare feet silent on the wet ground. Neither spoke for a long time, and the only sound between them was the quiet rhythm of the rain. As night fell, they came upon an old barn half hidden behind a grove of cottonwood trees. It looked abandoned, but it would keep them dry. She pushed open the heavy doors, and the scent of old hay and rain-soaked wood filled the air. The boy slipped inside first, his movements quick and cautious, like an animal used to being chased. She followed, closing the doors behind them. Inside, she set down her satchel and eased herself onto a bale of hay, pressing a hand to her lower back. The boy stayed by the door, watching her carefully. After a while, she broke the silence. "You must be hungry." She pulled out a small loaf of bread and a piece of dried meat from her bag.
No.
When she held it out, he hesitated, as if waiting for her to change her mind. "Go on," she said softly. "It's for you." He stepped closer, took the food, and ate quickly but quietly. His eyes stayed alert, studying her between bites. She watched him, trying to read the story behind his silence. He couldn't have been more than 12, but there was something in his face that didn't belong to a child, a kind of guarded wisdom that only came from seeing too much too soon. When he finished, she asked, "How long were you on your own?" He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "A while," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Do you have a family?" He shrugged.
No.
She looked at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. You can rest here tonight. We'll figure things out in the morning." He didn't move. "Why'd you do it?" he asked suddenly. "Why'd you buy me?" Her hand went again to her belly. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind," she said quietly. "Because maybe I need saving as much as you do." The boy didn't answer, but his eyes softened, just a little. She leaned back against the hay and closed her eyes. The barn creaked softly in the wind, and the faint patter of rain on the roof lulled her into a light sleep. The boy stayed awake for a long time, watching her. By morning, the rain had stopped, and a thin fog hung over the fields. She woke to the sound of birds and found the boy sitting near the open door, staring out at the mist. He looked like he'd been awake for hours. "We should move," she said, standing carefully. "There's a farmhouse a few miles up the road. Maybe they'll have some work for us." The boy nodded, and together they set out again. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wet earth and the faint sweetness of wild grass. They didn't talk much, but the quiet between them no longer felt strange. As they walked, she thought about how she had ended up here in a strange town, buying a boy she didn't know. Her life had once been simple, but that felt like a lifetime ago. She'd grown up in the northern plains, on a farm her father had built from nothing. Back then, everything had seemed certain. She'd married young, to a man who promised her the world. But promises were easy in those days, and keeping them was harder. When the drought came, it took the crops first, then the cattle, then the hope that had held them together. Her husband had left one morning, saying he'd find work in the city and send for her soon. That was 3 years ago. No letter had ever come. When she realized he wasn't coming back, she sold what was left of the farm and set out west, hoping to start fresh. But life out here didn't forgive easily, and the world had a way of reminding her of everything she'd lost. The boy didn't know any of that, and she didn't plan to tell him, not yet. Some truths were best left buried until they found a reason to be told. By midday, they reached the farmhouse. It stood alone at the edge of a field, the paint long faded and the fence half fallen. A woman came out when she saw them, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked cautious but not unkind. Morning, the pregnant woman called out, "We're looking for some work, or maybe a place to stay for a few days." The farmer's wife studied them both, her eyes lingering on the boy and the woman's swollen belly. After a long pause, she nodded. "We could use some help with the chickens and the fence," she said. "You can sleep in the shed out back." They thanked her, and the rest of the day passed in quiet labor. The woman mended fences while the boy helped gather eggs. It was hard work, but there was a strange comfort in it, something steady, something that made them feel almost normal. That night, as they sat outside the shed near a small fire, the woman asked him, "Do you remember where you came from?" He poked at the fire with a stick. "There was a camp," he said finally, "by the river. My PA worked the boats. Then one night there was a fight, and I ran. Did you ever go back?" He shook his head. "Didn't want to." "Why not?" "'Cause someone died that night," he said softly. "And I think they think it was me." Her breath caught, but she didn't press him. The flames crackled between them, throwing flickers of light across his face. He looked younger in that light, more lost than dangerous. After a while, she said, "You can't outrun what's behind you forever, but you can walk far enough to see it differently." He glanced at her, not quite understanding. She smiled faintly. Over the next few days, they settled into a quiet rhythm. The farmer's wife, whose name was Mrs. Clay, grew fond of the boy. She often slipped him extra food or let him feed the horses. The woman, meanwhile, helped with whatever chores she could manage. But even in the calm, a shadow hung over her, a sense that something was closing in. One afternoon, while the woman was washing clothes near the well, she noticed a rider on the road. He stopped by the gate and spoke with Mrs. Clay for a few minutes. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the farmer's wife glance toward her and the boy before shaking her head. The rider turned and left, but not before casting a long look in their direction.
That night,
when Mrs. Clay brought them supper, her face looked uneasy. "A man came asking questions," she said quietly. Said he was looking for a boy. Said there's a bounty out for him. The woman's heart tightened. Did you tell him anything? Mrs. Clay shook her head. No, but he'll be back. He looked like the kind that doesn't give up easy. After she left, the woman sat for a long time by the fire, the boy sitting across from her. Is it true? She asked softly. Is someone after you? He hesitated, then nodded. There was a man by the river. He hurt my friend. I tried to stop him. He fell into the water. I think I did it on purpose. She exhaled slowly. And did you? He shook his head. I swear I didn't. She studied him, searching his face for any trace of deceit, but found none. She reached across the fire and took his hand, surprising them both. Then we'll keep moving, she said. You're safe with me. He looked down at their joined hands, his eyes glistening in the firelight. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked like the child he truly was. But that night, as the wind howled outside the shed and the fire burned low, she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts turned over and over about the bounty, about the man who'd come asking, and about how she had tied her fate to a boy she barely knew. The child inside her shifted, reminding her of another life waiting to begin. She wondered what kind of world she was bringing it into, one filled with suspicion, loss, and restless souls searching for redemption. Outside, in the dark, a horse's hooves clopped softly on the road, fading into the distance. She lay awake listening, knowing deep down that the peace they had found here wouldn't last. Something was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it reached them. The boy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something she couldn't understand. She looked at him, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. The fire crackled once more, sending a small burst of sparks into the air. And in that quiet, uncertain moment, she realized that their stories, hers, the boy's, and the one yet to be born, were now bound together by something stronger than chance. Somewhere beyond the fields, thunder rolled again. The same kind that had followed her from Hollow Creek. The same kind that warned her that the storm wasn't over. It was only waiting for the right moment to return. The next morning broke with a sky heavy and gray, the kind that pressed down on the land until everything felt smaller. The woman woke early, her body sore from the hard floor, her mind restless from a night without real sleep. The boy was already outside, feeding scraps to the chickens. He looked calm, but there was a watchfulness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something had changed since Mrs. Clay mentioned the bounty. The quiet they'd found was beginning to thin, like smoke in the wind. She joined him by the fence, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. We might have to leave soon, she said softly. Before that man comes back. The boy nodded, though his jaw tightened. I don't want to run again. I know, she said. But sometimes running is what keeps you alive. He looked up at her, his face pale beneath the early light. Where would we go? West, she said. There's land past the river towns. People don't ask many questions there. She didn't mention that westward was where her husband had once promised to build them a new life, or that she still carried a folded letter she'd written to him but never sent. In that direction lay everything she had tried to forget. Later that morning, Mrs. Clay's husband returned from the fields with a worried look. That man came by again, he said quietly. Ask more questions? He's got a badge. Said he's a marshal from over by Red Hollow. The woman's heart dropped. A marshal. He nodded. Said the boys wanted for questioning in a killing near the river camps. He's got papers, too. Looks official. Mrs. Clay glanced at the woman, her expression torn between pity and fear. You should leave before he comes back, she whispered. If he finds you here, he'll bring trouble to all of us. By sundown, they were back on the road. The wind carried the chill of the coming winter, and the dirt beneath their feet was beginning to harden from the cold. The woman walked slowly, the weight of her pregnancy making every mile feel longer. The boy carried her satchel without complaint. He didn't talk much, but every now and then, he'd glance at her as if checking she was still all right. As darkness crept in, they reached a small bridge crossing a shallow stream. They rested there, sitting on the edge of the wooden planks. The woman unwrapped the bread Mrs. Clay had given them and handed half to the boy. The air was still, except for the faint sound of water and the whisper of wind through the trees. After a while, she said, If what the marshal says is true, they won't stop looking. The boy stared at the stream. They'll think I'm dangerous. Are you? He hesitated before shaking his head. No, but people believe what they're told. She studied him. We have to make them see something else. He frowned slightly. How? By living long enough to show them, she said simply. Sometimes the truth doesn't come from words. It comes from what you do after. Her words hung between them, quiet but certain. He didn't answer, but the tension in his shoulders eased. As the night deepened, they made a small fire near the bridge. She lay down with her shawl around her, feeling the baby's faint kicks beneath her hand. The boy sat awake again, his eyes following the shadows. It was his habit now to watch, to listen, to make sure they weren't being followed. He didn't tell her that twice that day. He thought he saw a man on horseback far behind them, too distant to be clear but close enough to keep him uneasy. By morning, the fog had lifted and they were on the move again. The land opened up ahead of them into a stretch of grassland, dotted with scattered trees and the faint outlines of distant farms. Somewhere beyond that, the road split toward the river ferry. She knew if they could cross it, they might be safe for a while. As they walked, the boy began asking questions about her past. Gentle ones at first? Was your husband kind? She thought about it for a long moment before answering. He was once. But hard times change people. Do you think he's still alive? She looked out at the horizon. I don't know. I used to believe he was. I just believe he's gone. He nodded quietly, understanding more than she expected. In him she saw a reflection of her own uncertainty, both of them shaped by loss. Both holding on to something fragile that still felt like hope. As the sun climbed higher, they stopped by an abandoned cabin near a grove. The roof was half gone, but the walls still stood strong enough to keep out the wind. They decided to stay there for a day or two, to rest and gather strength before the river crossing. Inside, dust floated in slanted beams of sunlight. A few broken chairs lay scattered, and the faint scent of old smoke clung to the air. The woman cleared a corner and spread out a blanket while the boy explored the surroundings. He returned with a tin cup and a rusty knife he'd found near the door. Could be useful, he said, his tone practical. She smiled faintly. He was learning to think ahead, just like she'd had to. That night, as the fire burned low, she began to tell him a story, not about herself, but about a woman she claimed to have once known. The woman in the story had lost her family and crossed half the country alone, carrying only a secret that could destroy her if anyone found out. The boy listened, eyes fixed on her, the firelight flickering across his face. What happened to her? He asked, when she stopped. She kept walking, she said, even when she didn't know where the road would end. He nodded, his gaze distant, as if thinking of his own road. The next morning, the sound of distant hoofbeats woke them. The boy was up in an instant, peering through a gap in the wall. He turned to her, his voice low. Someone's coming. She struggled to her feet, her heart pounding. How many? Just one, he said. Looks like the same horse I saw before. They packed quickly, putting out the fire and gathering their few belongings. She glanced out the doorway. A lone rider was approaching slowly, the dust rising behind him. The man's hat was pulled low, but even from a distance, there was something deliberate in his movements. We can't go through the fields, she whispered. He'll see us. The boy pointed toward the back of the cabin. There's a trail through the trees. It goes down to the creek. They slipped out quietly and followed the narrow path, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves. Behind them, the sound of the horse drew closer. Once they reached the creek, they crossed it barefoot, wading through the cold water until they reached the far side. When they looked back, the rider had dismounted near the cabin, scanning the ground. He's tracking us, the boy said. The woman caught her breath, then took his hand. Then we'll give him something to follow, just not us. They moved along the creek. Doubling back twice before cutting into the trees again, the boy understood her plan without words. They left faint tracks toward the hills, then circled south where the land opened into grass. By the time the rider picked up their trail, it would lead nowhere. By afternoon, they reached a small hollow sheltered by rocks. They rested there, exhausted. She leaned back against the stone, feeling the ache deep in her lower back. The boy sat beside her, staring out toward the horizon where the faint trail of dust still lingered. He won't stop, he said quietly. No, she agreed. But neither will we. She smiled faintly, though her strength was fading. The child inside her shifted again, reminding her that time was running short. She had promised herself she'd reach the river before the birth, but the road ahead was longer than she'd thought. As night fell, they built a small fire again, careful to keep it hidden. The boy ate quietly, his eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the rocks. He had changed since Hollow Creek. His fear had hardened into resolve. He wasn't running anymore. He was protecting her now. Later, when the fire was nearly out, she said, "If anything happens to me before we reach the river, you keep going." He turned to her sharply. "Don't say that. You need to know," she said gently. "There are people out there who will believe you're guilty. Don't let them decide who you are. You have to keep walking." He looked at her, his jaw tight, then said, "I won't leave you." She smiled, touched his arm, and said no more. Far away, thunder rolled again, faint but steady. The woman looked up at the dark sky, feeling the wind shift. Somewhere behind them, a lone rider followed the fading marks of their passage, the faint trail leading him closer with each mile. Neither of them knew how close he truly was or how much their fates were already intertwined. But as the firelight dimmed and the shadows deepened, one truth became clear. The storm they had been running from wasn't just weather. It was coming for both of them. It carried with it the secrets that Hollow Creek had tried to bury. The wind grew sharper as they drew closer to the river. Trees thinned, and the land began to slope downward, revealing stretches of open ground that looked silver under the pale moonlight. The woman's steps had slowed, her strength fading faster each day. The boy walked beside her, silent but alert, his small frame carrying both their burdens now, the satchel, the blanket, and what little food they had left. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke from somewhere far off, maybe a campfire from a traveler or someone watching the road. She stopped to rest by an old fence post half buried in the ground. Her hand pressed against her lower belly, feeling a sharp tightening that made her catch her breath. The boy noticed and turned quickly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said after a pause, though her voice trembled. "We're close. The river's not far now." He looked out toward the dark horizon. "Do you think that man's still following us?" She hesitated. "Yes, I think he is." Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them was filled with the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass. Then she pushed herself up again, forcing her legs to keep going. The boy followed, keeping his eyes on the road behind them every few minutes. As they moved, the landscape began to change. The air grew damper, and they could hear the distant rush of water. The woman felt a flicker of hope, but it was thin and trembling. She knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. If the marshal had tracked them this far, the river crossing might be their only chance. But even that was uncertain. The ferry ran only when the current was low, and lately the rains had made it unpredictable. They reached the riverbank by dawn. The light was gray and cold, spreading slowly over the rippling water. Across the river, the land rose into low hills covered with mist. For a moment, it looked like freedom. The boy dropped the satchel beside a tree and stared at the water. "How do we cross?" he asked. She looked around, scanning the shoreline. A few hundred yards down, she spotted a small dock with a flatboat tied to it. "The rope swayed gently in the current there," she said. "If we can get across before anyone finds us, we'll be safe." The boy nodded, and they started toward it. But before they had gone far, a sound stopped them, the faint echo of hooves on the far side of the riverbank. The woman froze. The boy turned sharply, eyes wide. They crouched low behind a patch of brush. The sound grew clearer, deliberate, steady. A single horse. The woman's heart pounded as she saw a figure appear on the rise across the water. A man on horseback scanning the bank. The sun caught the edge of his badge, glinting like a small piece of fire. The boy whispered, "It's him." The woman's breath came quick and shallow. She thought fast. "We can't let him see us," she said. "We'll wait till he rides downriver." But the man didn't move. He sat still, looking straight across the water as if he already knew where they were. The boy's fingers dug into the earth. "He found us." Her mind raced. She knew they couldn't outpace a horse, not on foot, not like this. The only way was across the river, but the current was fast, and the ferry looked too heavy to move alone. She glanced at the boy. "We'll have to try." They crept along the bank, keeping low. The man on the horse hadn't crossed yet, but she could feel his gaze sweeping the shoreline. When they reached the dock, she untied the rope and pushed at the ferry. The wood groaned, but began to shift. The boy climbed in first, grabbing the oar. Hurry, she said, climbing aboard. Her hands trembled as she pushed off, the boat swaying as it drifted into the current. Halfway across, she heard the distant splash of another horse entering the water. She looked back. The marshal had driven his horse straight into the river, the animal struggling against the current as it swam toward them. The boy rowed harder, his arms shaking with effort. "We're not going to make it," he said. "Yes, we will," she said, though her own fear cracked through her voice. The water lapped at the edges, and the ferry rocked wildly. Her shawl slipped into the river, vanishing beneath the rushing dark. The horse was gaining. A man shouted something across the water, but the wind tore the words away. As she looked back again, she could see his face now, hard, focused, relentless. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man carrying a duty he didn't want to have. Then the ferry hit a submerged rock, jolting sideways. The boy lost his grip on the oar, and it spun out of his hands. The boat tilted dangerously. She caught his arm, pulling him close. The current dragged them downstream, spinning them toward the far bank, but also toward a fallen tree jutting out from the water. "Hold on!" she shouted. The ferry struck the log with a violent crack, and for a moment she thought it would flip. Water splashed in, cold and heavy. The boy clung to her. Then the ferry scraped past the log and began to drift slower, closer to the far side. They made it to shallow ground, stumbling out, soaked and shaking. The woman collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The boy helped her up, his eyes darting back to the river. The marshal had reached the middle now, his horse fighting the current. "We need to run," the boy said. She tried to move, but a sharp pain tore through her lower body. Her breath hitched. "Wait," she whispered. "I can't." He looked at her, panic rising in his eyes. "You have to, please." She grabbed his hand, steadying herself. "Go ahead. Find the old barn past the hill. I'll follow. I'm not leaving you." "Do as I say," she said, her voice low but firm. "You have to trust me." He hesitated only a second before nodding. Then he ran, disappearing into the trees. She turned back to the river. The marshal had reached the far bank and was dismounting. His horse shook itself dry as he started up the slope toward her. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She backed into the brush, trying to move quietly. Every step sent pain through her body, but she didn't stop. She could hear the marshal's boots crunching on the wet ground, closer and closer. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice steady but not harsh, "you need to stop. I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't answer. She kept moving through the trees, using the sound of the wind to cover her steps. "I know you're scared," he said, "but the boy's got to come with me. There's people who need answers." She froze behind a tree, her breath caught in her throat. The baby kicked hard again. She pressed a hand against her side, her vision blurring for a moment. Then the marshal appeared between the trees. He stopped when he saw her. His face was tired, streaked with dirt and rain. He lowered his gun slightly. "I'm not here to take you," he said. "Just the boy." She shook her head. "He didn't do anything. Maybe not. But he ran, and that makes things worse."
Yeah.
"You can't hide him forever." Her hand tightened around the edge of her shawl. "You'll ruin him if you take him back." The marshal sighed, his shoulders dropping a little. "Ma'am, I don't make the law. I just carry it." "Then maybe the law's wrong." They stared at each other for a long moment. The wind carried the smell of wet pine and the distant roar of the river. Somewhere behind her a bird took flight, its wings slicing the air. Then from the trees came a sound, a branch snapping. The marshal turned sharply. The boy had come back, standing a few yards away, his small figure tense and defiant. "Leave her alone," he said. "Son," the marshal said carefully, "you need to come with me. I don't want anyone else getting hurt." The boy shook his head. "You're not taking her." The woman stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Go, please. Don't make this harder." But the boy didn't move. He stood between them, fists clenched, his eyes bright with fear and anger. The marshal looked from one to the other, torn between duty and pity. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "If you run again, they'll send more men next time. They won't stop at talking." The woman took a slow breath, fighting through the pain. "Then you'll have to go through me first." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound of the river filled the silence. Then thunder rumbled again in the distance, low and rolling like the earth itself was holding its breath. The marshal took one cautious step forward, lowering his weapon completely now. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you don't know what you're protecting." She looked him straight in the eye. "I know exactly what I'm protecting." The wind tore through the trees, scattering leaves around them. The boy's chest rose and fell fast, his small hands trembling. The marshal hesitated, the weight of his decision written all over his face. And then, somewhere between them, between fear and mercy, between the river and the storm, everything stopped. The air grew heavy and the world seemed to hang by a thread, waiting to see who would move first. The woman's heart beat so loud she could barely hear the thunder anymore. She knew whatever happened next would change everything for her, for the boy, and for the man who'd chased them this far. The moment stretched thin as glass, one breath away from breaking. The air felt thick enough to choke on as the three of them stood facing one another. Rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops, dotting the leaves and darkening the soil beneath their feet. The woman's hair clung to her face, her breath shallow but steady. The marshal's hand hovered near his belt, not out of threat but hesitation. The boy stood between them, his chest rising and falling, his small frame shaking from exhaustion and fear. For a moment the world was quiet except for the low hum of the river behind them and the sigh of wind through the trees. The marshal looked down at the mud, then back up at her. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. She didn't answer, only took a step back and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're leaving," she said. "You can turn around now and forget you ever saw us." He didn't move. "You know I can't do that." His voice carried no anger, just a tired weight, the kind a man carries when he's done too much and understood too little. The law says I have to bring the boy in. There's questions only he can answer. The boy's voice cracked when he spoke. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It just happened." The woman turned sharply to him. "Stop. You don't have to explain anything." The marshal sighed, pushing a hand through his wet hair. "I know, son. I believe you. But believing and proving are two different things." Lightning flashed far off in the sky, illuminating their faces for a brief moment. In that light, the marshal saw something he hadn't before. The way the woman's hands trembled. The tightness around her mouth and the deep exhaustion behind her eyes. She wasn't running from justice. She was running to survive. He took another slow step forward, careful not to startle them. "If you come with me, I'll make sure they hear your side. I'll say what I saw. Maybe we can fix this." The woman's laugh was short and hollow. "Fix it? You can't fix what's already broken. You think anyone will listen to a woman like me? To a boy who can barely speak for himself?" The marshal didn't respond right away. The rain was heavier now, soaking through his coat. Finally, he said, "Maybe not. But maybe it's time someone tried." The woman's gaze softened for a moment, then hardened again. "You don't understand. The world doesn't forgive the poor. It doesn't forgive mothers who make mistakes. It chews us up and moves on." He didn't deny it. Instead, he took another small step forward and held out his hand to the boy. "You don't have to run anymore." The boy looked at him, then at her. His eyes were full of questions he didn't know how to ask. She saw it and felt her heart twist. She wanted to tell him it would be all right, that she could protect him forever, but deep down she knew she couldn't. Her strength was fading fast. The pain in her body had become sharper, deeper, and she could feel the warmth of blood beneath her dress. She steadied herself against a tree and whispered to the boy, "Go with him." He turned in shock. "No, I'm not leaving you. You have to," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about you having a chance. It's about being free." The marshal lowered his hand. "I'll keep my word," he said quietly. "He'll be safe." The woman's eyes searched his, and something in her finally gave way. Not trust exactly, but resignation, the kind that comes when fighting any longer means losing everything. She knelt in the wet grass, pulled the boy into her arms, and held him tightly. "You listen to him," she whispered. "You keep your head high and tell the truth. Don't ever forget who you are." Tears mixed with the rain on the boy's face. "You'll come find me." She smiled faintly, though her lips trembled. "I'll always find you, one way or another." The marshal waited, his hat low against the rain. When she finally let go, the boy hesitated, then stepped toward him. The marshal placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. He looked back at her one last time. "I'll make sure he's treated right," he said. She nodded, too weak now to speak. The two figures turned and started back through the trees, the boy looking over his shoulder again and again, until the mist swallowed her from sight. When they were gone, the woman sank down against the tree trunk, her body trembling. The pain in her abdomen was sharp, unrelenting. She pressed her hand against her belly, whispering softly, as though to calm the child within her. The world blurred around her edges, the rain, the trees, the gray morning light, all folding into one another. She thought of the life she had left behind, of the husband who had died too young, of the promises she couldn't keep. She thought of the boy she'd taken in when no one else would, of the nights she'd held him close while thunder rolled outside and fear filled their small home. She thought of all the roads they had walked, and how every one of them led here, to this moment by the river. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. She looked up and saw the marshal returning alone, his coat hanging heavy and dark with rain. He stopped a few steps away, his face unreadable. "I left him with the preacher's wife at the old post station," he said. "She'll keep him warm and fed. I told her he's just a lost traveler for now." The woman closed her eyes, relief and sorrow mixing in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He knelt beside her, taking off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "You need help? There's a town 10 miles east. I can take you." She shook her head. "No, you've done enough." He looked around helplessly, then back at her. "You don't have to do this alone." A faint smile crossed her face. "I've been alone most of my life, Marshal. This isn't new." He wanted to argue, but something in her tone stopped him. He realized then that she wasn't afraid anymore. There was peace in her eyes, the kind that comes when someone finally stops running. For a long while, neither spoke. The rain slowed to a mist. The river kept flowing, steady and endless. When the marshal finally stood, he looked down at her and said quietly, "I'll make sure he knows what you did for him. One day he'll understand." She nodded weakly, her eyes half closed. "That's all I need." He hesitated a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the path. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the bend in the trail, he looked back once more. She was still there beneath the tree, wrapped in his coat, her face tilted toward the sky. By the time he reached town with the boy later that day, the rain had stopped completely. The sky was a clear, pale blue. The boy sat quietly beside him, clutching a worn locket in his small hands, the only thing she had left him. Inside was a faded picture of her, and a scrap of paper with a single line written in shaky handwriting. "Well, you are loved more than you will ever know." Years later, when the boy had grown into a man, he would return to that same riverbank. The world had changed around him. New bridges, new roads, new names, but the water still moved with the same quiet strength. He would stand there for a long time, feeling the wind on his face, remembering the woman who had given him everything she had so he could have a chance. He'd whisper to the air, not expecting an answer, just feeling the weight of her love still echo in the trees. Somewhere deep inside, he knew she had found her peace, and in that peace, he found his own. The story of their journey would fade with time, but the truth of it would remain, that love can survive even the hardest roads, that sacrifice can shape the course of a life, and that sometimes the quietest courage is simply choosing to keep going when there's nothing left to hold on to. As the sun sank behind the hills, painting the river gold, he finally turned away, the locket warm against his chest. He didn't need to look back. He carried her with him in every step he took, in every breath of the wind that touched his face. And in that moment, the river no longer sounded like sorrow. It sounded like home.